Welcome back to I Wonder. Today's question is really based on some stuff that has been in pop culture lately. The movie based on the book called It Ends With Us has spiraled into all kinds of TikTok and Instagram drama around why the cast isn't talking and how they're marketing it and yada, yada, yada. Anyway, it has me wondering, with all the controversy surrounding the movie and the book, what is the right way to talk about domestic violence? And is there one? So let's get to it. Because on this episode, what we're going to do is talk about it, is talk about what domestic violence is, talk about why people sometimes don't notice it, answer some questions that I get all the time about what it is, how do I look for it, how do I prevent it, all of those things. So let's jump right in. So the reason that I'm talking about this is threefold. First, let me give you my professional background. I am a trauma therapist, as you know, if you've ever listened to this podcast before. But what that really means is that I often work with people who have come out of challenging life situations, either the childhood that they grew up in or the adult relationships that they're in now. I don't want to say my career started because there was a lot of stuff in between, but one of my very first jobs out of graduate school was as a sexual violence advocate in a courthouse in the county where I live, working with a domestic violence organization, an incredible organization locally. I will make sure I link in the show notes. If you're anywhere in Monmouth County, New Jersey, you can utilize their services. And if you are not in this area where I live, there's a ton of information on the website that you can use, and also they can help you get to where you need to get. There's this whole network of organizations that all know each other and will help you find where the local one is to you. Anyway, I digress. My job with this organization was a sexual violence advocate in a courtroom because there was some changes to the law around sexual violence where I live, and not a lot of people knew it. The survivors had more rights than they used to. And so part of my job was out in the world, speaking at middle schools and high schools and women's organizations, talking about healthy relationships. And part of my job was being in the courthouse with the other two court advocates who were there to help people through the process of obtaining a restraining order for a violent partner. Because there were changes to the law that were so new, there wasn't a whole lot of traffic for me to help with survivors of sexual assault. I did some counseling, but really the courthouse part of it, in the beginning of my job anyway, I spent the bulk of my time working with people who were there for domestic violence restraining orders. What people don't talk about a lot is that often includes sexual violence, because intimate partner violence is intimate partner violence. So often there's physical stuff, but as sexual stuff as well. So I worked with people who had survived it all. And I got really passionate about helping in that area specifically, because I was just always so impressed with the people that crossed my door. I would say women because it was largely women, but there were a few men clients too, and some same-sex couple clients that I had as well. So domestic violence does not discriminate. It is in every relationship that it could possibly be in, no matter what that relationship looks like, there's a potential for it there. So that's the professional background. I work a lot still with survivors. I don't work for that organization anymore, but I work in private practice, and I have a lot of domestic violence, either people who are getting out of relationships, are out of relationships, or who are maybe sometimes are currently still in them and trying to discern what's the next best step for themselves. Or maybe they come to me and they don't even realize they're in a domestic violence situation. And then we sort of get to that point over, years and sessions and lots of time talking about it. So that's the professional part. The personal part is that I was a kid once in love, and my first sort of true love was, I was a high schooler, I think. And I'm not talking about the boyfriends that you kiss behind the dumpster in middle school or elementary school. I'm talking about like a true love, like somebody that I really thought, oh, this is a real grown-up relationship. There was no violence, but I lost myself in it. As a teenager, as you do as a teenage girl, right? Like you kind of do what they want you to do. You try to fit in with them and their friends. You do all of those things. But I didn't start out that way. And the attraction wasn't for that. The attraction on their part was, I think, because I was this kind of independent, headstrong human. And as I was in that relationship, which, by the way, I had no interest in the beginning, I was sort of pursued and then eventually gave in. And I bring that up because you hear that a lot in domestic violence situations. Again, this person did not do anything to me, but you hear that a lot, that people are like, oh, wasn't interested at first, but he kind of wore me down. We'll get to that later. But anyway, for me, it was this sort of formative experience of I was pursued. I got into a relationship. I fell in love. I changed who I was. I got left because, what's the fun in being with somebody who doesn't really challenge you anymore and doesn't really, who isn't really themselves anymore. And that really changed how I looked at relationships for really the rest of my young adulthood until I met my current husband, which is the third part of this. I am really passionate about helping people with relationships because I am really fortunate to have found a really good one. Like I said, that early formative experience of mine I ended that sort of setting my jaw in that, like, no one's ever going to get one past me anymore. I'm never compromising for anybody. I'm never changing for anybody. I'm never, doing anything different. And really what that probably did was maybe kept me out of some bad situations, but also probably kept me out of some good situations too, because I was a little stubborn in my ways. And so then the third part of why I'm so passionate about relationships is because I met the man that I've been now with for the better part of my life. We've been married 26 years and we've been together 30 years. So I think I can safely say we have figured out how to be in a relationship with one another. And there are some like white flags. The man has so many white flags, like so many good things, but that I didn't necessarily know were the keys to a successful relationship in the beginning, but have since over the last 30 years realized that's kind of what they are. So there you go. Those are my sort of professional and personal reasons for why I want to speak about this and why I'm so passionate about speaking about this. And so speaking of flags, white flags, red flags, often when I talk about domestic violence or healthy relationships in general, I get asked a lot of the time, well, what are the red flags? What are the warning signs? What should I look for? And how do I keep from being in these relationships? I get asked that a lot when I'm doing education and I'm out speaking, but also from survivors, you'll sometimes hear like, I should have known, or I should have seen, or because they have now the benefit of looking back on something out of the safety of the situation they're in now, they might say, I don't know how I missed that, or I don't know how. And I know for sure outsiders say, how did they miss that? Why didn't they leave? How come they're still there? How come, all of these questions. And part of the reason we ask all those questions is to other ourselves from that situation. We don't want to think we'll ever be in that situation. And so we ask all these questions that we think, oh, well, we would never fall for that, or we would never do that, or we would never see it. And I'm here to tell you, I have not worked with a single person who has survived a violent relationship and thought they didn't know enough, or they should have known better, or they should have seen it. I've never thought that. They've never thought it. They almost universally are women who say to me, or men who say to me, I never thought I would fall for something like this. I never thought I would get into this. They're educated. They're experienced. They're wealthy sometimes. They are, in industry or in careers where you would think they'd be able to sort of suss things out. It doesn't matter. It doesn't discriminate. It doesn't know any better. And often I don't talk about quote unquote red flags because they're very hard to see. And so instead, what I like to focus on is what you feel and how you feel in a situation. But we're going to get to that. So hold on. I want to tell a little bit of a story because I think it shows sort of how people end up where they are. And that is that when I worked in the court, one of the first things we did, we would work with people who were there for, like I said, for restraining orders. They'd had an incident or many incidences, and it was the final straw. And they were coming to say, this person needs to stay away from me. And one of the very first things we did was sit down with them with what's called we called the domestic violence wheel, the cycle of domestic violence. I called it a wheel. It was the cycle of domestic violence. And in sort of the general system, there's 4 parts of that. And it's cyclical. So it, starts here, but then it keeps going. And when I worked with people, almost inevitably, maybe not every single person, but almost every single person, we would get to one of those 4 parts, usually the same one. And I'll tell you about that in a minute. But we would get to one of those 4 parts and they would literally look up at me and go, oh my God, that's me. Like, how did they know that was going on in my house? How did they know? How did whoever wrote this piece of paper, how did they know that was me? Almost every single time. And what that taught me was nobody sees it in the beginning. Nobody, while they're in it, says, this is a red flag. or I shouldn't allow this. It's not like they're ignoring things. It's not like they're, not noticing and just like going on about their business. And then one day they find themselves in this abusive relationship. It's this insidious, slow, meticulous, easily justifiable in the beginning thing that happens. It's not always physically violent. It's almost never physically violent in the beginning. And often by the time you get to a place where you're like, what is going on? Then you can look back and realize there's a whole bunch of stuff. But when you're in it, you don't see it. It's like being in the eye of the storm. It's calm right around where you are. I want to say, and I will say this a lot, it is never the survivor's fault. There is never anything the survivor has done or not done to put themselves in this situation, to deserve it, to get it because of something, to any of it. It's never their fault. It can be a systemic fault of a person not knowing what the healthy relationships look like. One of my personal parts, I talked about my first relationship when I was, a teenager, but really one of the other personal parts is like, my dad died when I was 4. I didn't really have well, that's not true. I didn't have a father in my life, but I had a whole bunch of like male figures, my siblings, partners or boyfriends or husbands, my friends' dads. Like I had a lot of men in my world. Thankfully, I had one, there were wonderful relationships in my life. And so I had a lot of men in my world, but I didn't know as a kid, but I sort of learned pretty quickly, like, oh, I am real eager to have male approval. I liked my friends' dads more than I liked my friends' moms, or not liked, but I was seeking out their affirmation and attention more than, not in any kind of weird way. Don't get, it wasn't gross. It was just like, I didn't have this at home. I didn't have a dad at home to tell me good for you or to play baseball with me out back or to do any of those things. And so when I could get that, it was pretty cool. And so, I grew up in the age of Oprah. So we were all talking about our feelings and figuring out, and overanalyzing ourselves. And so I had a real awareness of like daddy issues, if you will, and how maybe I needed to watch out for that as I went into these sort of romantic relationships. I had a keen awareness that I wasn't trying to replace a father. I was really like almost too much aware of not doing that to people. That said, I don't know if I didn't grow up during a time of Oprah, if I didn't have older siblings to sort of model life after, I don't know. It could have gone another way. I could have really sought out that male validation and ended up in a dangerous situation at some point because I was ripe for that. I was ripe for being controlled and being in a situation that I didn't recognize was bad until it was, so bad you couldn't ignore it anymore. So I understand. I've never been in a domestic violence relationship. I've had instances, but I've never been in a domestic violence relationship. However, I totally understand how one could get into one. So it is not ever anybody's fault. And there are a lot of steps that we don't take as a culture, as a society, to help people stay out of them. And so that's kind of what this podcast for me is. It's a way of talking about like, what's good? What should a healthy relationship look like? What should you expect? And what do you not have to take? What do you not have to expect? What do you not have to put up with? What do you not have to be patient with? We don't talk about that a lot. When I would go out into high schools, mostly my job was to talk about healthy sexual relationships and consent. And so we didn't talk, it wasn't in the curriculum to talk a lot about just general healthy relationships, but I couldn't help myself most of the time. And so I would spend a lot of time with the students talking about what are you doing in a relationship? How is your boyfriend or girlfriend treating you? How are you allowing it to be treated? These things that feel like love to you or that feel like something to you might actually be control. They might actually be, jealousy isn't something that you should have in a relationship. Trust is, and kindness is, but not jealousy. And we don't do that. I was coming into these schools and I can tell you, I was the only person talking about it to these students. I mean, maybe their counselors were talking about it to them one-on-one, but they were not generally getting healthy relationship conversations in these middle and high schools. And so, this idea of consent, I used to go and do consent conversations to kids who were leaving for college. And largely we got money for that because there's 25% of freshmen report being sexually assaulted. So schools were like, oh yeah, I guess probably we should pay for that kind of education, right? By the time you get to senior year of high school, a lot of these kids have already had sex, or they've definitely been in relationships. And so their idea of what healthy looks like has already been started to be formed. I mean, I was 14 or 15 when I first, quote unquote, fell in love. And so that's, by the time I got to senior year, if somebody came in and talked to me about what to expect in a relationship, it was not too late, but it certainly wasn't catching me at the precipice of me getting into that situation. So I digress. What I was talking about before, that wheel of domestic violence, you can, when you see it in black and white, people go, oh my gosh, that's my life. But it's really hard to see that that's your life when it's not right in front of you in black and white. And if we're not doing anything preventatively, if we're not making podcasts, if we're not going into schools, if we're not talking to people when they're young about what to expect and what not to expect, if they don't see it at home, like I did, I was so lucky. I didn't have a dad, but I had all these wonderful couples in my life that were role models of how to be in a couple. But if I didn't have that, I might have put up with a whole lot of different stuff. If I didn't have my heart broken at 16, I might have, ended up in a more dangerous situation later on. So I luckily had some lessons early on, but if you don't have that, how do you even know what you're supposed to expect or not expect, or accept or not accept? Okay, back to the wheel. Let me talk to you about what's on it, because I think, going back to those questions of how do they, why don't they leave? How did they not see it? All of those things. When we're like in healing relationships with people, when I work with people after the fact, or after they're out, or, while they're getting out, there are so many layers of the onion that you have to get through. There's the shame for getting there. There's guilt for feeling like you were part of it. There's what ifs. What if I had stopped it then? What if I had, done it there? This sort of universal thing. And the thing that we're trying to get to as we unpeel all those layers is listening and trusting your gut. Most of the time, if you've been in a relationship that's unhealthy like this, I'm going to stop using the word violent, because it doesn't have to be physically violent to be an abusive relationship. So if you've been in any kind of abusive relationship, the common thing I see is that people lose their ability to trust their own selves. Things get so distorted, and you're gaslit, or you're manipulated, or you're coerced into believing certain things, that you sometimes forget what reality is in the relationship. What's okay, what's not okay, what's normal, what's not normal. And if you grow up in a place where you don't see anything else, then normal looks a whole lot different for you than it does for some other people. So when I would show people that wheel and they would say, how did you know this was going on? That was our opening to be able to say, well, because this is what violence looks like in every situation. And so even though you are unique, this isn't. This pattern is not unique. And, you're right to think that it wasn't okay. It's amazing how frequently you kind of have to affirm people that, yeah, you're correct. Yes, you are right. Yes, you are allowed to feel bad about this. Yes, this is unfair. Yes, you don't deserve this. You have to really convince them, because they've learned to sort of shut off that internal protector that keeps us from being treated poorly. So the getting back to the wheels, the ones we used in court were simple and had 4 phases. And again, they're a cycle. So it starts with what I used to call the eggshell phase, which is like the period of time where you're sort of walking on eggshells. But if it's the beginning of a relationship, you don't know you're walking on eggshells yet, because it's new. And so I saw some other wheels online that had pursuit as one of the stages. And I thought, oh, that's nice. That's a nice addition, because we just had the eggshells, the incident or the explosion, the reconciliation phase, and then the calm or the honeymoon phase. And I'll explain all those in a second. But I liked that this new wheel, and I'll link to it in the show notes, because it was on a website that you can go and find all kinds of other information too. That one added pursuit and a couple other phases that helped to see the bigger picture, as far as like if you're just meeting somebody or just dating somebody. But the wheel that has the 4 phases, that eggshell period is usually where women looked at me and went, oh my gosh, that's me. It's the period you get to, not in the beginning, but you get to a place where you're, I don't want to say soul focus, but oftentimes soul focus is, how do I manage this house, this family, this day, this time, this space, to keep the peace? What do I need to do? What do I need to say? What do I not need to say? What do I need to hide? What do I need to bring out in the open to keep the peace. And that's the insidious, sneaky, often you don't realize it's happening until somebody says it to you, because it's become your normal. You are in a place where this is part of your relationship, is sort of appeasing or keeping happy or keeping calm. You've taken that on as your responsibility. Again, not your fault and not your responsibility. It's usually done because you've been told it's your fault, and you've been told it's your responsibility. And if you didn't do these things, then I wouldn't do these things. This can look a lot of ways in this phase, in the eggshell phase, as I like to call it. If the violence is violence, if it's physical violence, then you're mostly just trying to keep that at bay. The problem with domestic violent relationships is that always there's this control that happens, that there might not be a violent incident for years. And yet there are all this other manipulation and gaslighting and coercive behaviors that have the survivor, changing who they are and what they do. The incident and explosion piece, again, if it's not violent, it could be they move all your money. They call you names. They tell you you're stupid. They sell your car. They do something big that affects you greatly without any of your consent or, input at all. Again, the obvious in the violent situation is a physically violent act, but there can be a whole bunch of other things that happen that are that incident phase or the explosion phase. Then it's typically followed by some sort of reconciliation or honeymoon. And the reason I did a slash there is because the honeymoon phase can be romantic and lovely. And it can be the part where you're suddenly going, oh, it must be my fault because look at how wonderful this person is. They're so kind. They're so over the top. They're so sorry. They're so sorry this thing happened. They're so sorry that I feel bad, and they don't want me to feel bad. And so it's easy to get pulled right back into that. However, sometimes that phase also looks like where the gaslighting comes in. It looks like the survivor being manipulated to think that they are the reason for the explosion, whatever the explosion was. I sold your car because you're irresponsible and you didn't tell me you were going to be home late. Or you bought yourself a new sweater, so I had to sell the car. Or if you just didn't do these things, or, you're too busy with the kids. And so I went out and, bet all our money at a card game because you're so busy with the kids. I wasn't getting any attention. And so that phase, that reconciliation / honeymoon phase, it might not look like a honeymoon. It might look like the time where the person is convincing the survivor of all the reasons that they are actually the cause of this incident that just happened. A lot of times, a particularly tricky part of gaslighting is when there's this sort of understanding of why are you mad at me? I didn't mean that. This terrible thing happened, but I didn't mean to hurt you. You know me. I'm a good person. Why would I mean to hurt you? Instead of actually taking any kind of accountability or having any humility in the situation, it's more of I'm hurt that you're hurt by me. You should know better. So that part's tricky because it can be honeymoony. And usually in the beginning of a relationship, it is honeymoony. There's something that happens that you don't feel good about, and then that person doubles down on the gifts and the romance and the sweetness and the kindness and the I'm so sorries and all of that. Usually as relationships go on, that honeymoon piece isn't quite the same. And it becomes more of I'm so sorry that you're hurt. Let's try not to do that next time because I hate hurting you. Not great, but it happens. And by the time you get to there, you're usually so in it that it feels the same. It's often a time for the survivor to second guess themselves, to be did I even experience that the way that I think I did? Because now it feels like it didn't even happen the way that I thought it happened because of the way they're talking. And then when you move out of that phase, there can be some relative calm. But I always thought that was an interesting thing to call it because to me, you're actually just rolling right back into that eggshell phase. So it's calm in the sense that the partner isn't exploding or isn't, outwardly doing anything controlling or manipulative. And so in theory, you should feel okay in those moments. And sometimes in the beginning of a relationship, you do, because it hasn't happened enough for you to think that there's any kind of pattern or to expect that it's going to happen again. So in the beginning of a relationship, that period of calm feels just like that. Like, oh, this thing happened and it was awful, but everything's okay now. So we're going to be fine. After some time, again, usually when people ended up in court, they would say, oh, we don't even get that. It goes straight from either the honeymoon or the blame into me now walking on eggshells because I've learned that I have to do certain things to keep it from happening again. Or like, I might be the only way it's not going to happen again. But that tends to escalate as well. So just when you sort of think you've figured out how to do it, there can be another thing that sets them off or makes them angry or makes them feel like they're losing control. There's another wheel that I saw that has something called the standover period, which I thought was so interesting because it goes there from like honeymoon to build up to standover. And I thought that's a really great way of getting out of the physical violence piece and talking about all the other types of domestic violence, which is emotional or just simply controlling, or financial or in any way where the person is like reasserting their dominance over the relationship. And usually that happens right before another explosive incident. So, in the beginning phases, a lot of those phases can look, in the beginning parts of a relationship, a lot of those things might look like a normal relationship, or love. You hear a lot of stories of, especially now, if you're anywhere on social media, you hear about love bombing. People talk about it all the time. And I get nervous with that because it's the same thing when I preach about how don't overuse some of these words. Love bombing can feel amazing in the beginning. And why would you think anything about it that's not great? It's this person's so romantic and they bring you flowers and they want to spend all their time with you and they don't mind hanging out with your friends in the beginning. And they want to be with you all the time and they'd rather be with you than anybody else. And, all the things that could feel great. Again, going back to me as a kid, as a kid who didn't really have a lot of like male gaze, to have somebody be so totally devoted to me would have felt amazing at that time. And also that tends to be when they're beginning that control piece. Well, if I am giving you so much of myself, why wouldn't you start to do these things for me? So let's talk about control because it is the center of all of this. In fact, my favorite wheel of all is one, I don't know who created this one originally, but it shows up on a lot of domestic violence places now. I just read something the other day about a woman who saw it on the inside of a women's room stall. And I thought, oh, that's brilliant. That's brilliant because, just like the women that I had in court or the survivors that I had in court who would see it in black and white and be like, oh man, this is me. And maybe for the first time realize like I'm in a relationship I don't have to be in. To see that on the back of a bathroom and just start reading it and think, oh my gosh, this all sounds very familiar. And at the top of this thing, this is saying this is what it looks like to be in a domestic violence relationship. That is a really powerful thing. And this podcast or this blog post that I read, she said like it was the kind of the first time I went, oh, that's me. And that's not great. And so it can be really affirming to people to see it. And so I love this wheel because in the very center of the wheel is power and control. And then the spokes are all of the sort of different tactics, manipulation and financial control. And then around it is, physical violence, sexual violence, emotional abuse, like all the different things that it can be called. And the center is that control and power. Because the thing that I learned when I was working with people is that, as I've said a couple times, DV isn't always, and sometimes never, about physical violence. And sometimes that violence occurs without domestic violence. Sometimes there's like a violent incident and that's it. And it's the only time. Or sometimes a person drinks too much and does something really stupid and violent and then never does it again because they quit drinking. They're not always totally hand in hand. And oftentimes domestic violence, or what we call domestic violence, is not necessarily about physical, or at the very least doesn't start with physical violence. It is that power and control piece. It's about how does the perpetrator get control and keep control. And if they ever feel like they don't have or they're losing that control, then that's when things get bad. So that's where that eggshell piece comes in. The survivor learns how to behave in a way that gives that other person the illusion of control. If they ever catch on, it doesn't go well. And, we joke all the time in the world about heterosexual relationships and about how, the woman's in control and the man just thinks he is. We joke about that a lot. It's probably not a great joke, because a healthy relationship doesn't have an element of control. There is no, I'm not saying it's 50-50, and I'm not saying it's always going to go a person's way. I'm saying a healthy relationship doesn't have to do with control. There is no part of my husband or I that is trying to control the other one. We're trying to get our needs met, and sometimes that doesn't line up. And we're trying to protect ourselves, and sometimes that doesn't line up. And sometimes your childhood stuff and all the other things can come into that and make that need to control and that need to protect get in the way of healthy relationships. That's not the same thing as the coercive control and the power grab of a domestic violence relationship. So let's go back to my husband, because we started this by saying, how do you talk about domestic violence? This controversy over the movie, in case you don't know. I haven't seen the movie yet. Full disclosure, I haven't seen the movie yet. I probably will, but I did read the book. It's a Colleen Hoover book. It's called It Ends With Us. It's part of a series wherein she has domestic violence. There's a history of it in this young woman's life. And then she grows up and marries a guy who ends up being violent. Yeah, violent, actually, not just controlling, but also violent. The book, if I remember correctly, there was a lot of controversy around too. And I don't know for sure, but I believe part of the controversy around the book was that some people thought this writer was trying to make you sympathetic to the abuser. As somebody who has worked in this field for so long, I actually read it as I thought before I knew for sure. I thought when I read it, this person has experience with domestic violence. And sure enough, her mother is a survivor of domestic violence. The author's mother is a survivor of domestic violence, which therein means the author is also a survivor of domestic violence because she grew up in a house with it. That's what came across to me. Oh, this person knows the real deal about domestic violence, which is that sometimes the people are nice and sometimes the people are charming, and sometimes it's hard to discern whether this is really a bad thing, whether it's going to happen again, whether it's worth blowing up your whole life over. Also, sometimes these perpetrators have their own history of domestic violence, a lot, more often than not, have their own history of domestic violence. Sometimes they really are upset and sad about the fact that they're doing it. Sometimes they truly believe they're not going to do it again. Doesn't mean that happens, but they believe it. So I didn't read it as she was sympathetic to this guy. I read it as she was realistic about the situation. So that was the controversy around the book. The controversy around the movie is possibly completely made up, but the controversy right now is that the person who plays the character who is the violent husband is also the director of the movie. And then Blake Lively, who plays the lead in the movie, the woman who grew up with it and then marries into it and blah, blah, blah. I'm spoiling a little bit of this. I'm sorry. Apparently they had a falling out. They're not doing any press with each other. They aren't seen in the same space. They're really marketing. There's just so many things happening right now. People are upset at her for marketing it a certain way. People are upset. People love him for the way he's marketing it because he's marketing it as a movie about surviving domestic violence. And she apparently is marketing it as like a rom-com or take your girlfriends to this. I'm going to speak on that too, because like the book controversy, I feel like some of that marketing movie controversy is her trying to be an empowered woman and saying, this movie isn't about this woman surviving domestic violence. It's about this woman and her life and how this is part of her life. But look at all the other things she did. And again, as somebody who has worked in this field with people, I love that message. To me, that message is not that she's trying to avoid the domestic violence part. To me, that message is that she's trying to say this main character is way more than just what happened to her. And the story is about way more than just what happened to her. And the story is about way more than that guy. And yes, he has a history and he has a background and that's important. But also look at her and what she's done over here and how important is she and how important is her whole total story, not just the fact that she survived this one thing. So as you can tell, I don't really buy into either side of the controversy. I didn't buy into the book controversy, the people that were really upset about the book. And I also have not heard from any survivors of domestic violence that they thought the book was bad, nor have I heard from any domestic violence survivors that they're mad about the movie. I have heard a lot of survivors complain about Blake Lively because they think she's not addressing the domestic violence part. I don't know that they've seen the movie or not seen the movie, but my default setting is to listen to survivors because they know. And so I'm not going to wade into the controversy about either the book or the movie other than to say I didn't see a lot of what people are complaining about in the book. And with the marketing of the movie, I can sort of see the flip side of what people are saying. People are saying, oh, don't equate this movie with, your Betty Buzz non-alcoholic drinks or your flower shop or your clothes or your whatever else she's trying to do to market it. And I wonder, again, I don't know, but I wonder, is she trying to market stuff or is she trying to say this movie's about more than just this woman surviving domestic violence? Which I kind of love. If that's the message, that's a great message. Because every survivor I've ever worked with, their life is about way more than just the domestic violence they've lived through. So back to my husband. The reason that I want to talk about him is because he's my most tangible example of white flags. We talked earlier about how I don't like to talk about what to look out for necessarily because I don't think you're looking out for it most of the time. Yes, can you look back and say, oh, I shouldn't have fallen for the love bombing. I shouldn't have fallen for him wanting to be. I should have seen that he was isolating me from my friends. I should have seen that he didn't want me to hang out with my family. I should have seen that he was always the victim and everything. Yeah, maybe. And I could tell you, those are all things to look out for. Like, is he constantly the victim? Are you constantly wrong? Is he constantly trying to get you away from people? Is he jealous? Does he always want to know where you are? Does he always want to know where you have been? Does he always want to know who you've been with? Does he want control of the money? Does he want you to stop working when you get married? Does he want, all of these things can be red flags. And also, we're sometimes not looking out for them because they can also just look like part of a relationship. The white flag that I mostly got lucky, I think it was instinct. And so I'll tell you two things. The thing about my husband, and before we get too far into this, let me be very clear. The man is not perfect. There are plenty of days where he drives me over the edge and where, I'm practicing my patience with him and his personality. So let me not don't think that this is the, and for 30 years, we have worked at this relationship. He's not perfect. I am not perfect. We are not perfect together, but we have worked and we have chosen it and we have turned, toward one another in plenty of different times. It is not without conflict and it has not been out without some blow up conflicts over the years. And I would still choose him every single day because he's got the one characteristic that I think is key. And that is humility. Again, don't get me wrong. He can be the most arrogant dude you'll ever come across. And he has moments that have all of the women in his life rolling their eyes and his sisters probably especially rolling their eyes at his, bravado. But in real times of depth, he is not afraid to listen, to contemplate. Maybe he's the one that needs to change. Or to be patient with me if I'm the one that needs to change. And that to me is the humility and the reason why the two of us are still together all these years later. So here's what he doesn't do, ever. He doesn't call me names. I don't call him names. I think every once in a while we've cursed at each other and I have a trash mouth. So to say every once in a while we've cursed at each other is a real exercise in self-control. Because I curse all the time just in regular language. And so when we're fighting and I'm trying not to, that's a real purposeful and intentional decision. But I never, over 30 years, we've definitely called each other, asshole, or I honestly don't think he's ever called me bitch or any of those, the sort of typical things you'd call each other. But generally speaking, over 30 years, we don't call each other names. We just don't. There was one time in our 30 years together where he said something that cut so deep that it did raise oh boy, I can't do this if this is going to be who he is. Now, it was right after we had our first baby. We were completely sleep deprived. I was really vulnerable because I had postpartum depression and I had admitted to him that I wasn't feeling particularly confident about my parenting skills. And in the heat of the moment, in the middle of the night, he said something about not trusting me with the baby. And that was exactly the wrong thing to say, right? And it was a terrible fight. And I, for days, I think, really thought oh my God, have I made a horrible mistake? We've been married for 5 years, by the way. We didn't have kids right away. And 22 years later, he is still sad about that. like upset that he said it, upset that he hurt me, upset that he even like had the capability of doing something like that. And so that's how I know it's humility. You know, he didn't mean it. He didn't. And he also didn't try to talk me out of being hurt by it. He didn't mean it. I know he didn't mean it, but he didn't use that against me. He was like, yeah, you should be as upset as you are. And I'm going to give you all the space you need. And I'm going to tell you why I think I was wrong. And I'm not going to demand that you forgive me or, you know, accept it or think of it. And it's literally never happened again. I've never felt like ever again the way that I felt in that moment. The other thing, all these, 30 years in, the John and Julie Gottman, the like experts on couples, they are couples therapists who have done extensive research on couples. And they talk about turning toward your partner in times of conflict or anything as one of the biggest predictors of success in a relationship. And I would say, in addition to humility, that's the other thing that he and I do. Even in that time of, the few days after that incident when we were much younger, I thought, well, who do I talk to about this? Because he's my person. I turned to him. I turned to him in goodness. I turned to him in sadness. I turned to him in conflict. I turned toward him in all of it. I turned toward him and say, what are we going to do about this? Even when we disagree, I look to him for helping me solve the problem. Healthy relationships do that. You turn toward one another. You don't assume the worst. You don't prepare yourself for danger in a healthy relationship. I have never, not for 1 second of 30 years, felt unsafe with this man. Never. And that's not wild. It's not something that you should think when you hear it, oh, well, that's for you. No, everybody deserves to feel safe in their relationship. And if you don't, that's the red flag. If you don't feel safe to express yourself, if you don't feel safe to be who you are, if you don't feel safe to disagree, if you don't feel safe to stand up for your beliefs, that is not the relationship for you. And I don't mean safe in the sense that you think you're going to get hit or pushed or shoved or punched or driven off the side of the road. I mean, like the little kid version of me, I didn't feel safe that the relationship wasn't going to end if I did anything that wasn't supposed to happen. I didn't feel safe to stand up for myself after a while because if I disagreed, maybe he wouldn't love me anymore. I wasn't safe to, to push back on some things that I didn't agree with because what if he left me? So I don't just mean physically safe. I mean emotionally safe. I mean safe that it's going to last. You shouldn't have to be accommodating a person 24/7. There are times where I accommodate my husband and he accommodates me because we don't agree with the other one, but it's just for the safety of the couple and for the goodness of the family. We do what the other one wants in that moment. There are times, but it is not I don't wake up in the morning and think to myself, how do I accommodate this person? Because I feel safe to just show up and be who I am. If you aren't feeling safe in your relationship, stop and look at that. Ask yourself why. Ask yourself what doesn't feel safe. Do you not feel physically safe, or do you not feel safe that he is going to stick around or she is going to stick around or they are going to stick around? If you don't feel safe in this relationship, whatever it looks like, ask yourself why, and then go one step farther and say, is it me? Again, we go back to my childhood. Is it my daddy issues or is it this person? Are they trying to make me be a certain way? Are they asking me to be a certain way? Or am I throwing up those roadblocks because of my own self? In a healthy relationship, neither one of those things happens. I'm not saying all the time. When we fight, you're going to get defensive sometimes. I mean, that's why couples counselors exist. That's why I'm here. I would have no job if everybody fought fairly all the time, and in every conflict. So our old stuff's going to come up and we're going to sometimes not fight fair. That's not the same thing. That's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is, how do you feel, generally speaking, in this relationship? Do you feel safe? Do you feel comforted? Do you feel like you can trust that person with your own good self? Or do you feel like you have to be a certain way in order for it to be safe? Do you feel like you have to act a certain way in order to be loved? Do you feel like you have to do certain things in order for them to protect and take care of you? If what they do is conditional upon what you do, examine that. Think about that. So I came on here saying, how do we talk about this? What do we say? I will tell you, this movie and this book has me compelled to say more, Because I think a lot of what's happening now is some really brave survivors are out there telling their stories and talking and trying to advocate and trying to help people. And I think that's amazing and awesome. And also, I think there are people who don't listen because they think, well, that would never happen to me. I'm never going to get into that relationship. Well, obviously, she should have seen that coming, or he should have seen that coming, or he should have gotten out, or why didn't they leave? But if you get a person who's over here saying, I know what it looks like, I'm not in that, and I'm telling you, you can have this side. You can have all the goodness. You can have 30 years of trust and safety and laughter and comfort, not without some, rough patches, but largely speaking, it's healthy. You can have that. You don't have to settle for anything else. And it's important to talk about that because if you haven't seen it, I didn't see in my own home. I saw lots of other outside examples of healthy, but I didn't see in my own home what healthy was because there wasn't a relationship. She was a widow. If you grew up in a house where the relationship wasn't healthy, then what do you know about what you deserve and what you can expect? So listening to people who do know, asking yourself, what feels good to me? What feels right? And if it doesn't feel good or right, how come? So while red flags are hard to see in the moment, I have learned that our guts often try to tell us when something's up, and that coercive control, that other person's whole mission is to silence our guts or even worse, to get us to stop listening to them. So they might still be telling us, this is not right, this is not right, this is not right. But the outside lesson is you're wrong to feel that way. I talked about all those onion layers we have to peel back when people are coming out of these relationships. That's where it starts. It starts with, how do I relearn to listen and to trust my own gut again? So ask yourself, are you drowning out the sound of your gut? What is your response when you ask yourself those questions about, do I feel safe? Do I feel loved? Do I feel cared for? Do I feel that I can trust being myself and showing up exactly as I am and continue to feel safe and loved and all of those things? And if you're justifying any of the stuff that's going on, it's not your fault. But if you're looking for a red flag or you're looking for risk factors, look at your own gut and your own response. All right. That's all I got for today, folks. I'm sure I'll be back with more. This is sort of the healthy relationships episode, but I get tons of questions about domestic violence and healthy relationships. And we didn't even touch on the sexual part yet. So we'll get to that in another episode. But for now, stay curious, keep wondering, and know that you are valuable and worth all the goodness in the world.